Hello and welcome. I'm Olga Hannanen, and this is Academia Experience. I'm a researcher at the University of Eastern Finland, and I always wanted to popularize science. Knowledge needs to be shared, not buried inside academia. So in Academia Experience, we discuss topical academic phenomena in everyday language to make them more approachable and understandable for everyone. Welcome aboard. My guest today is Dr. Kaya Barry, a cultural geographer and artist working in the areas of migration, mobilities, tourism, material cultures, and arts research. She is a senior lecturer and Australia Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Award Fellow at Griffith University.
Welcome to my podcast, Kaya.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. So among others, you research the embodied practices and experiences of temporary migration and mobilities. And one of your recent research is on so-called backpackers, or those who travel on working visa to Australia to work in Australian farms. This activity has been largely disrupted by the pandemic and the closure of Australian borders. So could you tell us a little bit more about this working holiday visa practice in Australia?
Yeah, so backpackers, which is kind of nickname for them, they're on the working holiday maker visa. Australia, like many countries, has got this reciprocal arrangement with many countries around the world to have young people come to Australia for anywhere between 1 to 3 years on a working holiday maker visa. It's been around since the mid-70s, but in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been considerable expansion of the visa. A lot more nations have been added. So currently there's 47 nations with the working holiday maker visa. So it's a nice big cohort. And they are encouraged, but also incentivized through the visa working restrictions to go and undertake farm work or regional work in specified locations. So backpackers in Australia have this hybrid status, being tourists, being the more long-term nomadic travellers, but also being a really key part of the workforce.
I see. Do you know approximate numbers of how big is this phenomenon?
I'm not sure. The numbers are always lagging behind of how the government reports them to how many people are there. I believe there's around 100, and it hit 100,000 early this year. So before the pandemic, you get anywhere between, around 100,000 to maybe 140,000. But they're the people who have a current working holiday maker visa. Because you have to reapply each year, so you get only granted a visa for 1 year at a time. Often people in between their visa applications will be put on a bridging visa. So there's actually a lot more people who would fall under the category of backpackers because they might be on bridging visas or transiting between visas. So it's sort of a really tricky estimate, but there's the backpackers thing would be around 30 to 40,000 usually.
That sounds like a big and significant number for Australian farms. So how did farms survive during the pandemic when this number didn't arrive to work?
Many didn't. So just for context, Australia closed its international border in March of 2020. It was a hard border closure. There was a permit-based system to get an exemption to either travel in or travel out. But that system was restricted to only people who were a permanent resident or Australian citizen. So anyone with a temporary visa was not able to even apply for it. When the border closed, there were around 130,000 backpackers in the country. At the end of 2020, 9 months into the pandemic, where things were pretty scary in most places in the world, still about 80,000 people were left. So even though the government told people on temporary visas, particularly tourists and backpackers, to go and leave while they still could, many chose to stay. So that kind of helped the farms for the first year. The second year was really hard. So Australian borders remained closed. The international border was closed for just under 2 years. So not only people were coming in. And then also on top of that, there were state border closures. So Australia's made up states and territories.
Yeah.
So there were internal border closures too. So it's not like if you're in Melbourne, you could just fly to Brisbane. That was very restrictive as well, which of course has huge impact for farmers who rely on seasonal workforces to move between the areas where fruit picking or produce is required. So the first year of the pandemic was pretty tough and a bit scary because everyone was juggling, health restrictions and lockdowns and things. But the second year, even though we were a little bit more familiar with restrictions and lockdowns, people had to start leaving because their visa was expiring or they wanted to go back home, and then new people weren't coming in. So many farms just had really devastating consequences. Many farmers chose not to plant next season's crops. There were many stories of the local community, local school groups, or local businesses just stopping work and going and helping farmers pick produce, berries, fruit, whatever it was, en masse. But there was just day after day of news reporting of fruit rotting on trees, oranges dropping to the ground. It was really, really.
I see. Another question, as now borders are open, so did these backpackers or those people who applied for working holiday visa, did they return in the same numbers, or how is the situation now?
We're almost back to, I don't know what the current stats are, but we hit 100,000 visas granted, but that's, it took a year to get back to that, whereas normally the visa places fill up really quickly. It's an ongoing group of people coming in. So the borders opened, but the problem was because having 2 years of no flights in it, virtually no flights in and out, the flight prices were very high last year. And so in 2021, when the borders opened, and then they've gradually decreased, and there's gradually more flights in and out of Australia, but it's still not the same as what it was in pandemic. So the cost is really prohibitive, and it took a long time for those prices to come down. So a young person who wants to take off for a couple of years to Australia just couldn't afford it. And there were also really lengthy visa delays. So people were waiting months, 6-10 months is quite common just to get a visa issue, just to get a backpack issue. So I believe that backlog of visa processing has kind of slowed for backpackers, but there were a lot of obstacles. And then also because of Australia's really, stringent border policy and very restrictive, people were quite scared to come because, in early 2021, we didn't know what would happen. We didn't know whether the borders would stay open, whether a new variant would come. So I think there was a little hesitation for people, but things are good now. And it's looking pretty good.
So did any policy changes happen to attract these farm workers or to attract
not so much policy, but things that have been moving along behind the scenes even before the pandemic. So before the pandemic, backpackers and most other migrant workers, anyone involved in farm work, was paid pretty terribly across the board because there was no minimum wage for horticultural work. So everything was done, most stuff was done by piece rate. So by the bucket of how many berries to pick or by the weight of how many tomatoes. So it was incentivized work, and there were a lot of pretty bad farmers and operators out there who were ripping people off. And because they're disposable migrant labour, they got away with it. The one kind of positive thing about the pandemic is a lot of people who've been doing really dodgy stuff had to shut up shop. And so it did clear out a lot of people who will probably come back, but it's tidying things up. And then there was also a government inquiry a few years back into the wages and exploitation of farm workers and working holiday makers, and they put in a minimum wage. So now everybody gets paid the minimum casual wage, and it's good. So people are getting paid good money for the work they're doing, and that has made just a significant improvement.
I find it interesting, in one of your reports you mentioned that these backpackers are not all low-skilled workers. those who engage in physical labor in their home countries. So could you tell a little bit more about who are those backpackers who are coming to work in Australia?
Yeah, and they're certainly not the stereotypical backpacker tourist we perhaps used to think about in tourism and release studies. They're often, quite a lot of the countries on the visa have an educational requirement, so they're required to already have tertiary education. So you get people who are specialists, there's nurses, doctors, police, teachers, lots of teachers, people who've been in professional jobs for quite a while and want to change and perhaps even take a gap year after school, things like that. So there are very different stages in life. I mean, the majority of them are young travellers, and that's good, but some of the nations on the visa are around up to 35 years. So they're in a very different life stage than perhaps somebody in their early 20s, which brings a really different skill set. And it also then begs the question, in a country like Australia, but many countries at the moment, because of the pandemic, have huge labour shortages. In specialist areas like healthcare, education, tourism as well. Yeah, like why aren't we utilising these skills? So it's a little bit, it's disappointing that, even though people come out and have a good time working on a farm, they could be teaching at the local school that desperately needs staff, or in the local hospital or the local clinic. And it's quite stark the contrast. But then also, because there's so many nations on it, they're not all the stereotype of a white European, British, or drunk backpacker at the top. They're from many walks of life, and many have very different motivations for how they decide to go somewhere far away like Australia. So it's sort of, I think, it challenges the tourism stereotypes around that nomadic drifting ideal that people have about tourism, and actually pushes it into migrant, discussions about migrant labour, because many nations on the visa are from developing nations, and some people are on the visa using it as a remittance, because they would earn far better money living in Australia, working on the farm, like everywhere. That's not as common. You do see people choose to stay and do the 3 years maximum to earn money and see their background. And that's how the visa is engineered to attract people to stay. So, Australia gets a lot out of it. Regional communities and rural communities get a lot out of it, but it's more and more edging towards just a labour visa rather than having to.
Yeah, speaking of that, you mentioned the motivations that some want to come to Australia for remittances to earn money, others want to travel. So do you think that there are more of those who want to come and explore the country, or others, or more those who want to just earn money, better money than back home?
I think the majority are the young travel. They want a good time, a good experience. But then you do find that people, Australia's a very nice country, and it's, got a fairly good standard of living compared to most places. So you spend a few months there and you might want to stay, which is really common. So then the backpacker visa, because it's 3 years and, and there's a work money in it, becomes quite attractive to people who perhaps have, found a relationship in Australia, have friends and family in Australia. A lot of international students that come and do their studies in Australia and then will come back later. This is the only visa available for them to come back and live in Australia, even though it's temporary. Soon it's up to 3 years to stay in Australia. And so I think it's reflective. I don't have the stats on these videos. There are people in the backpacker visa who are reflective of that desire to stay, who are locked out of any of the long-term visa options or residency options.
So do these backpackers, those who apply for a working holiday visa, do they come as individuals, or can we see that there are mediated agencies or companies that bring specific people, a group of people from a particular country? The reason I ask is that in Finland, for example, we have these fly-in workers from Thailand who come and pick up wild berries, blueberries and lingonberries. So is it also a similar practice in Australia?
To some extent, I mean, there's everyone's out to make a buck off someone. So there are migration agents and tourism companies who will help assist you to apply for a visa. There's many rumours around about people who would fly into Australia with a debt in their head, so they've gone through a migration agent, borrow the money, for their plane ticket, their initial accommodation, the service of providing them with work and things like that. And there's a lot of crap that goes on. It's all quite under the radar because it's obviously legal. And then they work off the debt. And so there are people who get bound into this through, more towards discussions around slavery. That's a very, very concern. For the majority of workers, you have to be a single person. You can't have a partner or any dependents. You can't have any children back home. So it's tailored towards a single person visa.
See, that's very restrictive.
Yeah. So they want people, the marketing point is it's a cultural exchange. It's tourism. But, if you're going to go and live 3 years somewhere, what happens? If you're into mid-20s to mid-30s and you have a family. So it's very restricted in that way. The other thing to note is there's also a similar visa that's geared towards agricultural workers, which is the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Visa, and that is for non-Pacific Islands nations and Timor-Leste, and they come on much more rigid restrictions around they're tied to their work. So there's a lot of farm workers who are from the Pacific who live and work alongside backpackers, but they can have, many of them are married, many of them have children back home. It does serve as a remittance scheme. So between, stereotypical farm workers, you've got backpackers from 47 different countries, you've got Pacific Islanders from 10 different nations. It's quite a diverse mix, and then they all have different motivations and needs and requirements. So it makes it really hard when we talk about backpackers to universalise the experience because it's very varied.
Well, thank you for sharing these very interesting insights about the Australian context, and which I find really interesting, and I personally learned a lot. So I look forward to hearing more insights about your research. So welcome again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. Check out academia experience elsewhere.